The Battle of Crécy in 1346 has often been described as one of the most dramatic turning points of medieval warfare, not only because of the massive loss of life that occurred in a single day but also because of the way it showcased the downfall of traditional chivalric combat in the face of evolving strategies and technology. This clash, between the English and the French, unfolded during the early years of the Hundred Years' War, a conflict fueled by dynastic claims, pride, ambition, and the shifting tides of European power. What made Crecy so infamous was not simply the staggering number of dead but also the humiliating circumstances under which the French army crumbled, with many blaming their defeat on poor leadership, chaotic planning, and the personal recklessness of King Philip VI of France, who was alleged by chroniclers to have been drunk during key moments of the battle. To understand why the blood of more than 20,000 men soaked into the muddy fields of northern France, it is necessary to look at the events that led up to this confrontation. England and France had been locked in a bitter dispute over territorial rights and succession claims. Edward III of England asserted his right to the French crown through his mother, Isabella of France, and while many saw this as a distant claim, it nonetheless gave him the political justification to wage war against the Valois king, Philip VI. In addition to dynastic ambition, there were disputes over the rich lands of Gascony, the control of trade routes, and the vital wool markets that supported both kingdoms' economies. War was not only a matter of pride but also survival for two monarchs who needed to show strength to maintain the loyalty of their nobles. Edward's campaign of 1346 began with a daring landing in Normandy, where his forces ravaged the countryside in a series of chevauchés, raids designed to terrorize the population, cripple the enemy's economy, and force Philip into battle. The English army, though smaller, was disciplined, cohesive, and highly mobile, relying on longbowmen, light infantry, and well-trained knights who could dismount to fight effectively. Edward's son, the young Prince of Wales, later known as the Black Prince, was only 16 years old, yet he would emerge from this campaign with a reputation that would echo across Europe. The French, in contrast, assembled a massive army in response, far larger than Edward's, with estimates ranging between 60 to 120,000 men, including heavily armored knights, mercenaries, Genoese crossbowmen, and feudal levies. Their strength lay in numbers and brute force, but as the events of Crecy would reveal, numbers alone could not overcome poor coordination and the dangers of muddy terrain when pitted against disciplined English tactics. The battlefield itself was chosen with care by Edward. The English king, aware that his forces were outnumbered, needed to rely on terrain advantage. He positioned his army on a sloping hillside near the village of Crecy-en-Ponthieu, with his men arranged in 3 defensive divisions. The archers, the pride of the English military, were placed in a forward V-shaped formation, creating overlapping fields of fire. The knights and men-at-arms dismounted to fight alongside infantry, reinforcing a solid defensive line. Trenches, pits, and obstacles were prepared to break up cavalry charges. Edward's strategy was to force the French to attack uphill through mud, under relentless volleys of arrows, and into a wall of steel. The French king, however, did not display the same caution. Philip VI, determined to crush Edward decisively, marched his army hard to reach Crecy. His men were exhausted, hungry, and many were poorly coordinated as they arrived on the battlefield late in the day. Chroniclers describe confusion and frustration spreading among the French ranks, as nobles clamored for immediate battle despite the late hour. Philip, reportedly unsteady after consuming too much wine, gave in to the pressure and ordered a series of reckless charges, setting in motion one of the most catastrophic defeats in French history. The first wave of the French assault came from the Genoese crossbowmen, mercenaries who had been contracted to provide ranged support. However, the crossbows they carried were inferior in rate of fire to the English longbow, which could release 6 arrows per minute compared to the slow reload of the crossbow. Worse still, the Genoese had marched long distances carrying their heavy equipment, and their pavises, large shields meant to protect them while reloading, had not arrived with them. Exhausted and vulnerable, they advanced against the English lines but were immediately overwhelmed by a storm of arrows. The English longbowmen, positioned on higher ground and with dry bowstrings, unleashed devastating volleys that shredded the Genoese ranks. Panic spread among the crossbowmen as they faltered, retreating in disorder. This retreat, however, enraged the French knights waiting behind them. Many French lords, scorning the mercenaries, rode down the retreating Genoese, cutting them apart for cowardice. This chaos only compounded the confusion and opened the way for the disastrous charges that followed. French knights, resplendent in their armor and banners, spurred their horses forward in wave after wave of assaults against the English lines. Yet the muddy terrain, churned by rain and trampled by thousands of hooves, slowed their advance. Horses slipped and stumbled, while the English archers rained death upon them. The longbows could pierce armor at close range, and while not every arrow penetrated, the sheer volume created havoc. Horses, more vulnerable than knights, were brought down in droves, throwing their riders into the mud, where they were finished off by infantry. Time and again, French charges were repulsed. The discipline of the English formations held firm. The young Prince of Wales commanded one division, and when his line came under heavy pressure, messengers rode to Edward III for reinforcements. Edward, watching calmly from a nearby mill, is said to have replied that his son must earn his spurs and learn the art of war. The boy stood firm, and his leadership inspired his men, ensuring that the English position did not break. As the battle wore on into the evening, the slaughter intensified. French pride and fury drove them to repeat the same mistake, charge after charge into the same killing ground. Chroniclers recorded that some of the highest nobles of France perished that day, including King John of Bohemia, who was blind yet insisted on riding into battle, tied to his companions so that he might die with honor. The carnage was immense, with estimates of French casualties ranging from 20 to 30,000, though exact numbers remain debated. What is certain is that the French suffered catastrophic losses, while the English losses were minimal, perhaps only a few hundred men. The mud of Crecy became a graveyard for thousands of armored knights, their bodies piled upon each other, their banners trampled into the earth. The French monarchy's prestige was shattered, and the myth of knightly invincibility was broken. The drunken folly of Philip VI became a story told across Europe, a cautionary tale of arrogance, disorganization, and failure to adapt to new methods of war. The battle also marked a revolutionary moment in military history. The dominance of the English longbow was established, signaling the decline of heavy cavalry charges as the decisive factor in medieval warfare. Discipline, planning, and the effective use of ranged weapons could now overwhelm sheer numbers and noble valor. The 100 Years' War would continue for more than a century, but Crecy set the stage for England's reputation as a formidable military power. After the battle, Edward did not march directly to Paris but instead laid siege to the important port city of Calais, which would eventually fall into English hands and remain under their control for over 200 years. Crecy was not only a battle won but a stepping stone to long-term strategic gains. The human cost, however, cannot be understated. 20,000 men or more lay dead, their lives extinguished in the mud, victims of pride, poor leadership, and the brutal realities of medieval combat. The image of a drunken king leading his men to slaughter became emblematic of the folly of kings who placed honor and rash ambition above prudence and discipline. For the peasants of France, who had been conscripted into the fight, the defeat was not a matter of lost chivalric honor but of broken families, devastated villages, and endless mourning. Chroniclers who wrote about the battle sought to explain how such a mighty army could be brought low by a smaller foe. Many emphasized divine judgment, portraying the English victory as a sign of God's favor, while others laid the blame squarely on Philip's poor choices. The story of Crecy became larger than life, shaping the way future generations understood the balance of power between France and England. The young Black Prince's reputation soared after Crecy. His bravery under pressure, his ability to lead men twice his age, and his calmness in battle earned him fame that would endure long after his death. For Edward III, the victory solidified his claim as a warrior king, respected across Europe. For Philip VI, however, it was a humiliation that haunted his reign and tarnished his legacy. Even centuries later, historians reflect on Crecy as a battle that symbolized the end of one age and the beginning of another. It revealed that medieval warfare was evolving, that the massed ranks of armored knights were no longer invincible, and that leadership mattered as much as numbers. It was a grim reminder that war was as much about strategy and discipline as it was about courage and valor. The mud of Crecy still whispers its story. Beneath the fields of northern France lie the bones of thousands who died not for glory but for the mistakes of their leaders. Their deaths remind us that history is often written in blood, that the decisions of kings can doom countless men, and that arrogance, fueled by wine and pride, can destroy even the mightiest of armies. Crecy endures in memory because it was more than a battle. It was a lesson, carved into the earth with steel and arrows, in the cost of folly and the power of change. Background of the Hundred Years' War and Edward III's claim to the French crown. The roots of the Battle of Crécy lie in the wider conflict known as the Hundred Years' War, which began in 1337 and would last, with interruptions, until 1453. The war was sparked by a combination of dynastic disputes, territorial ambitions, and economic rivalry. Edward III of England staked a controversial claim to the French throne through his mother, Isabella of France, daughter of King Philip IV. When the French crown instead passed to Philip VI of the Valois line, Edward saw his rights denied. In addition, the English crown held valuable territories in France, such as Gascony, and these holdings became constant sources of friction. Economic issues added fuel, particularly disputes over control of the wool trade and shipping routes in the English Channel. This tense mixture of pride, economics, and inheritance laid the foundation for one of the bloodiest conflicts of medieval Europe, culminating in great battles like Crecy. Edward III's invasion of Normandy and his strategic march toward Crecy. In July 1346, Edward III launched a bold invasion of Normandy with a force of around 15,000 men, a combination of knights, infantry, and longbowmen. His landing was carefully planned to strike at the heart of French territory, causing both panic and disruption. From the moment his army set foot on French soil, they carried out a devastating chevauchée, a scorched earth campaign involving burning villages, looting, and destroying crops. This was meant not only to weaken the French economy but also to provoke King Philip VI into open battle. Edward's men marched northward, pillaging towns and striking fear into the French countryside. By the time the English reached the Somme River, Philip had raised a massive army to intercept him. Edward then turned strategically toward the high ground near the small village of Crecy en Ponthieu, where he decided to make his stand. His careful choice of terrain would become a key reason for his success. The French King Philip VI's decision to confront the English despite exhaustion. King Philip VI of France responded to Edward's invasion by assembling an enormous army, far larger than the English force. Contemporary estimates place the French strength between 60,000 and 120,000, though the exact numbers remain debated. Philip gathered knights, mercenaries, feudal levies, and Genoese crossbowmen, determined to crush Edward decisively. However, his decision-making was flawed. By the time the French army caught up with the English near Crecy, his troops were weary from forced marches, poorly organized, and far from fully supplied. Many nobles urged Philip to wait until the following day to rest and prepare, but whether from pride, anger, or a desire to punish Edward swiftly, Philip insisted on battle. Chroniclers later suggested that the king's judgment was clouded by wine, making him impatient and reckless. The French would enter the battlefield tired, disorganized, and unprepared for the devastating discipline and tactics of Edward's smaller but more effective force. Edward III's tactical choice of battlefield near Crecy and defensive preparations. Edward III knew he was vastly outnumbered and therefore relied on intelligence, discipline, and geography to offset the French numerical superiority. He selected a position near Crecy on sloping ground, giving his forces the advantage of elevation. His men were divided into 3 carefully arranged divisions, with his son, the young Prince of Wales, commanding one under close supervision. Longbowmen, the backbone of the English army, were placed in a V-shaped formation on the flanks, ensuring overlapping fields of fire. Knights dismounted to fight as infantry, strengthening the defensive line, while trenches, pits, and wooden obstacles were set up to break up cavalry charges. This preparation revealed Edward's keen understanding of how to neutralize French cavalry strength. By turning the battlefield into a killing ground that forced the enemy to charge uphill into well-prepared defenses, Edward positioned his smaller force for maximum efficiency, setting the stage for a defensive masterclass. The role of English longbowmen versus French knights and Genoese crossbowmen. Perhaps the most decisive factor at Crecy was the performance of the English longbowmen. Each longbow, requiring years of training to master, could shoot up to 6 arrows per minute with deadly accuracy. This rate of fire completely outclassed the crossbows of the French's Genoese mercenaries, which took much longer to reload and lacked comparable power at long range. When combined with the elevation of the English position, the longbows became devastating tools of destruction. Against heavily armored French knights, volleys of arrows killed horses, disoriented formations, and left dismounted men vulnerable. Against the Genoese, who were under-equipped and weary, the English archers inflicted massive casualties within minutes. The longbow's superiority at Crecy marked a watershed in medieval warfare, proving that disciplined missile troops could devastate traditional cavalry charges. It wasn't just weaponry but the way Edward organized his longbowmen that reshaped the battlefield and doomed French hopes for victory. The poor condition of the Genoese mercenaries and their failed assault. The French relied on Genoese crossbowmen to initiate the assault at Crecy. However, these mercenaries were already in poor condition when they arrived. They had marched long distances under heavy loads, their crossbows were not ideally maintained, and worst of all, their large pavise shields, crucial for reloading safely, were missing due to logistical errors. Ordered to attack uphill against fresh longbowmen, they faced overwhelming disadvantages. As the English unleashed volleys of arrows, the Genoese quickly faltered, unable to match the pace of fire. Within moments, their formation collapsed, and they began retreating in confusion. The French knights, enraged by what they saw as cowardice, cut them down mercilessly as they fled. Instead of weakening the English, this first assault created chaos in the French ranks, disrupted momentum, and set a tone of disorganization that would plague Philip's army for the rest of the battle. The Genoese failure symbolized poor French planning. French knights charging recklessly into mud under heavy arrow fire. Once the Genoese had been routed, French knights launched repeated cavalry charges against the English line. In theory, the mounted knights should have been the decisive force, but the muddy terrain, churned by rain and trampled by hooves, proved disastrous. Horses slipped, stumbled, and became easy targets for longbowmen. Even when knights reached the English position, they faced obstacles, trenches, and defensive stakes that broke their momentum. Arrows rained down relentlessly, killing horses and wounding knights, while dismounted Frenchmen found themselves bogged in mud and struck down by English infantry. The knights' repeated attempts to break through only worsened the chaos, as successive waves trampled over the fallen. Instead of coordinated attacks, the French charged in fragmented groups, expending their energy for little gain. The field became a slaughterhouse, with French nobility and soldiers alike piling up in heaps under the merciless precision of the English archers. Philip VI's alleged drunkenness and disastrous leadership decisions. One of the most infamous aspects of the Battle of Crécy is the allegation that King Philip VI of France was drunk during critical moments of decision. Chroniclers hostile to the French monarchy described him as having consumed too much wine, clouding his judgment and fueling his insistence on immediate combat. While it is difficult to verify the exact extent of his intoxication, his behavior was undoubtedly rash. He ignored advice to delay the attack until his men could rest, failed to coordinate his vast army effectively, and allowed nobles to launch attacks prematurely. His inability to impose order or adapt to the unfolding disaster contributed greatly to the scale of French losses. Whether drunk or merely blinded by pride, Philip's leadership was catastrophic, turning a battle that might have been avoided into a humiliating slaughter. His reputation as a monarch never recovered from the shame of Crecy's disastrous defeat. The bravery and leadership of the young Prince of Wales, the Black Prince. At only 16 years old, Edward, Prince of Wales, later known as the Black Prince, played a remarkable role at Crecy. His division faced some of the fiercest French attacks, and at one point, his position nearly collapsed under the weight of repeated cavalry charges. Messengers asked Edward III to send reinforcements, but the king famously replied that his son must earn his spurs and prove himself. Despite his youth, the prince held firm, inspiring his men with his courage and resilience. His leadership during the battle cemented his reputation as a rising warrior prince. After Crecy, stories of his valor spread across Europe, and he would go on to become one of the most celebrated English commanders of the era. His performance at Crecy was more than symbolic. It was a demonstration that discipline, resolve, and personal bravery could withstand overwhelming pressure. The massive slaughter of French nobles and soldiers, over 20,000 dead. The sheer scale of bloodshed at Crecy shocked contemporaries and remains staggering even today. Chroniclers record French losses as exceeding 20,000, though some estimates suggest even higher numbers when counting common soldiers. Among the dead were not only countless men at arms but also a significant portion of the French nobility. The killing field was described as a carpet of bodies, with mud soaking in the blood of horses and men. Knights were trampled under their own cavalry, suffocated in the mire, or cut down as they struggled to rise in heavy armor. The English, in stark contrast, lost only a few hundred men. This imbalance highlighted the devastating effectiveness of their tactics and the futility of the French assaults. For France, the loss was not only military but social and political, as so many of the kingdom's leading lords perished in one catastrophic day of slaughter. The death of King John of Bohemia and other notable nobles. One of the most poignant stories from Crecy is the death of King John of Bohemia. Blind from disease, John nevertheless insisted on fighting alongside his men to uphold his honor. He ordered his companions to tie their horses together so that he could ride into battle with them. Charging into the English line, the blind king and his retinue were slain, their bravery remembered as both tragic and futile. Many other nobles perished as well, including the Duke of Lorraine, the Count of Blois, and numerous prominent lords whose deaths devastated the French aristocracy. These losses not only weakened France militarily but also created political instability, as inheritances shifted suddenly and leadership vacuums emerged. The death of so many high-ranking nobles made Crecy a national trauma, remembered as much for the collapse of France's knightly elite as for the loss of ordinary soldiers. Minimal English losses compared to catastrophic French casualties. The contrast in losses between the two armies could not have been more dramatic. While the French lost tens of thousands, the English lost perhaps a few hundred men at most. This disproportionate outcome was the result of superior tactics, disciplined formations, and the defensive advantage of terrain. English longbowmen inflicted heavy damage while remaining largely protected by their positions, obstacles, and the shield of their own men at arms. The decision to dismount knights ensured that English forces were less vulnerable to cavalry charges and better able to hold ground. The outcome highlighted how strategy could neutralize superior numbers. For Edward III, this lopsided victory bolstered his prestige immensely, demonstrating his capability as a commander. For France, the disparity was humiliating, showing the utter failure of their military system to adapt to new realities. The loss ratio became a haunting symbol of the disaster at Crecy. The psychological and political humiliation of France after the defeat. The defeat at Crecy was more than a military disaster, it was a psychological and political humiliation for France. The French monarchy prided itself on the strength of its knights and its reputation as the leading power in Europe. To be crushed so decisively by a smaller, invading force damaged morale across the kingdom. Nobles questioned Philip VI's leadership, while ordinary people faced despair over the loss of so many men. Internationally, France's prestige suffered, and Edward III's position strengthened. The Valois dynasty, already insecure in its legitimacy, now faced ridicule and criticism. Chroniclers across Europe portrayed the French defeat as divine punishment, reinforcing the idea that England held God's favor. This narrative would haunt France for years, complicating efforts to rebuild confidence and unity. Crecy was not just a battlefield loss, it was a national humiliation that destabilized France politically and psychologically. The long-term military impact. Decline of heavy cavalry, rise of ranged tactics. Crecy marked a turning point in the evolution of medieval warfare. The dominance of heavily armored knights, long considered the core of European armies, was shattered. The battle demonstrated that cavalry charges, no matter how noble or powerful, could be rendered ineffective by disciplined infantry supported by massed ranged weapons. The English longbow became the symbol of this change, showing how a well-trained corps of archers could devastate traditional forces. In the years that followed, militaries across Europe began to reconsider their reliance on knightly charges and to invest in ranged weapons and combined arms tactics. While knights would not disappear, their invincibility was disproven. The battle also emphasized the importance of battlefield preparation, terrain selection, and defensive strategy over mere numbers. Crecy foreshadowed the future of warfare, where technology and discipline would increasingly outweigh feudal tradition and the prestige of noble cavalry. Strategic aftermath. Siege and capture of Calais, strengthening English power. In the wake of Crecy, Edward III chose not to march directly on Paris but instead turned his attention to the port city of Calais. Beginning in September 1346, he laid siege to the city, cutting it off from supplies and subjecting it to starvation. After nearly a year, In August 1347, Calais surrendered. Its fall was a monumental gain for England, providing a permanent foothold on the continent that would remain in English hands for over 2 centuries. The victory at Crecy had paved the way for this achievement by destroying French morale and crippling their ability to resist effectively. Calais became a vital base for English operations in France and a symbol of their enduring strength. Thus, the Battle of Crécy was not only a tactical triumph but also a strategic stepping stone, reshaping the course of the Hundred Years' War in England's favor.